Hi, I'm going to give a quick overview of my PowerPoint on how to do assessments. My presentation included a short introduction between Stretch and Stripes, which sort of gave an overview of what we were going to be talking about. I also went over the definition of assessment, why, when, and what we assess, and some different forms of assessment. And at the end, I gave some examples of some student work from some children that I have observed. My introduction between Stretch and Stripes is kind of what I would call an icebreaker. It's just a little bit of an introduction to get the teachers ready and kind of in a more relaxed mood before we get into presentation. And they're discussing the fact of Stripes is going to help Stretch because they're both going to work cooperatively to take what each one knows and put them together to teach this workshop. I included the definition of assessment that came out of the dictionary, where assessments is an ongoing process which is aimed at understanding and improving student learning. And there's a little bit more detail into the definition that we discussed and then kind of had an open forum about. Um, and you want to remember that teachers want to enhance the student learning and use a variety of methods to collect their data and to give the feedback for the students. It's like a way to track the students. You know, what are the students learning? What do they need remediation on? Are they following all the state standards? So why we do assessments is broken up into three different areas between the teacher, the student, and the classmate. So the teacher needs to be able to know where to help the students and need to know what they already know and what they need help on, because they may be strong in one area but not in another. And they need to work on getting the students to reach their full potential. Then when you have the students need to have some positive reinforcement. They need to know why they're learning a certain skills, and they need to know where they're at in their learning and what they need to work on themselves for their personal goals. And then when you add in the classmates, it's teamwork. The kids learning to work cooperatively with each other, keeping the children focused, learning from each other, and in the end result, everyone will improve. I found this chart, and even though it kind of relates to the older child, I think that it can also pertain to the younger child because they may, even though they don't understand it yet, they still will be, as they're growing and they're learning to put the puzzle pieces together, it'll kind of, the whole picture will fit together. Like they're looking for things like what are their strengths and weaknesses? You know, how do they learn best? What can they remember and understand? Um, what do they need to focus on and where do they need to make the revisions? And what are their targets? What is their end result? And they need to know what they're doing. They need to know that how how do they think? What's their process when they go about it? And how will they know if their work is good? If someone doesn't read it and give them some some really positive feedback. And what do I need to do to improve? Usually children will want to improve for you if they really understand they need to improve and how to go about doing it, because children really like to aim to please. On when to do assessments, it should be it should be something that's done all year long, and some of it's documented and some of it isn't. But there ought to be certain forms of assessments which you're using the same form that's done the beginning of the year, in the middle of the year, and at the end of the year, so you can evaluate what the child has learned through that time. Or are they still struggling? Is there a way that you need to change your teaching to get that skill across so that the child can master it? And if you have a student that is going from school to school and a lot, well, that should be a red flag that you need to zero in on that child and make sure that the child is picking up. There's no gaps between their learning from one center to the other, and that they can become successful as well. When it comes to what we assess, what we really want to do is we want to find out where the child is. How does that child learn in a group? How does he learn when he's in by himself? We need to know his approaches to learning, his attitude, his values, his habits and styles. Does he have certain strengths and certain weaknesses that we need to build on? Is that child progressing from where he is now to where we expect him to be at the end? How, in his development of learning? Is his expected outcome following the standards, like the content standards, early learning standards, essential knowledge and skills, and the child's outcome framework for the goals and objective in the learning expectations? Or it could be a lot of other things on top of that. We are also looking for how the child is learning, the assessment of learning as well as the assessment for learning. And we need to always make sure that we are following the standards and the benchmarks designed for each grade level that is put out by the state. When we're looking at the different forms of assessment, you need to make sure that all your assessments will be the same for everyone. You can't work for one group of children and not the other. It needs to be something that's going to be fair for everyone. The standards must show some kind of reliability and some validity to test and evaluate the standards. There are types like formative and summative, objective and subjective, and its basis can be in comparison. It can be internal or external. It could be a part of the big controversy like No Child Left Behind or high stakes testings or Century 21 assessment, or the big one, the standardized testing of like FCAT, whether it's fair for everyone or if it's biased. You need to make sure to try and leave all bias out of all your assessments, even though it's not the easiest thing to do. There are different types of assessments like rating scales, checklists, narratives, anecdotals, portfolios, there's audio recordings, video recordings, descriptive narratives, jotting simple notes down, doing photographs, sketches, tallies, frequency counts, and the rubrics. And there's so many other different forms. You need to plan ahead. Make sure that everything is the way. Make sure that everyone is assessed exactly the same. And make sure that if you're planned out, you'll be able to have a schedule to follow, which will make it a whole lot easier. This first set of examples are from a preschool classroom, which is ESE and VE inclusion. And it shows their cutting and pasting skills, some fine motor skills, and some following directions. These examples come from the same preschool class. And I really like this idea because as the puzzle pieces are for each child, and if they were to put together, it would show how the children work as a group. And they're like badges that the children can kind of earn. When they learn what a color is, they'll get a badge that says, I've learned the color red. I've learned the color orange or yellow. They'll get one for I've learned my shapes, whether it's squares or triangles. I can cut my paper, or I have learned my ABCs, or I can count from 1 to 2. So as they learn skills, they can actually visually see that their puzzle piece is growing. And it kind of becomes a challenge for some of those, or not really a challenge, but it gives some of the ones who are struggling something to work towards because they have some examples to follow. These examples are also from an ESEVE class, but this is a K through 5 class. And they had a story that they were reading in their classroom. And then they had to take what they were reading and they had to do something to go along with the story. They were kind of retelling the story. And as you can see, you can tell the different ability of the different children just by looking at their drawings. And the teacher has put their first name and the date on each one of these drawings because these will have, when they come off the bulletin board, will go into the students' portfolios. Okay, this set of examples comes from kindergarten students. In the first one, Mrs. Price's class, they were doing self-portraits. How do they see themselves? And you can see the way the children draw at this point with some have bodies, some only have heads, and they have sticks and arms. And as they get older, that will change. They have numbers where they're counting the number, and they have to put the same amount of pictures to go with the number. And then there are story sequence and story recall that they do after they've read a story to make sure that they've understood the story that was read. And also with the puzzle piece one, that was another one when the story was read and then they had to recreate or retell the story in a picture. And one child's paper is totally upside down because they don't understand that concept yet. This is also from the kindergarten classes, and on their counting one, they took Cheerios and they would not only count the Cheerios, but they would form letters with the Cheerios, numbers with the Cheerios. They made squares and triangles working on their shapes. And so they were getting the hand and texture as well as the fine motor skills of playing with them and putting them down and counting them out. So there was many skills in that activity. The other ones show some different examples of what the 100-day school project came out, which they just had. And it shows different examples of how each child was able to incorporate 100 things on their pieces of paper. And I think this was more of a family activity that they brought back in, as well as something that they worked on in the classroom. Now that here are some examples of some first grade writing samples. On the top of the page, it shows they were writing a story, and then they were putting their own illustrations to go along with it. And you can see, again, even though they're all first graders, where they're at in the different levels between their writing and also their pictures and how they draw. Some are still very primitive, and some are actually starting to form something that you can really tell what it is. On the bottom was an interesting project where they had been reading about a book on someone's grandma's quilt or something. I can't remember quite the name of the story. But each one had their own paper, which they had to put either something about their family, something about the story, or they could just do anything they wanted depending on which classroom they were in. And then they put them together to make a class quilt. I included some of the references that I use. And besides my textbooks for this class and for 1601 and a few others that we've done in the past, I did a lot of my information from the Florida Department of Education websites. And I found this cute picture, and I think it really sums everything up, is that we need to be careful when we are assessing that we're doing it correctly, that we're not showing bias and judging anyone, because it's so easy to mislabel someone. Like in this picture, you have a dog and you're labeling them as a giraffe. So, I mean, it kind of shows how important an assessment is, that we need to do it and we need to stay focused on what we're doing so that we're using it to help the children learn and not to go the other way around.